We're now moving into a session looking more at life cycle thinking in use. And I'd like to introduce the next speaker, who's Dr. William Fawcett, who is Director of Cambridge Architectural Research. William is an architect with practice, consultancy and research experience. He holds the Chadwick Fellowship in Architecture at Pembroke College. I hope I got that right. He specialises in building simulation, looking at not just building performance in use, but also investment performance in use. And he's co-authored a book, New Generation Whole Life Costing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm a member of this CILECCTA team who've been working on new and hopefully advanced software which will bring the resources, new resources to practitioners. And I'm going to try to explain some of these innovative features. Essentially 4 topics. I won't go through in this list in detail. You'll see them as I go through the presentation. In general, all the points I make should apply both to LCC and LCA. I'm sure that's not strictly true, but in principle, I'm talking about ideas that are common. The first topic is to do with the very significant data demands for both LCC and LCA. On the left, this little box, deterministic LCC, LCA. This is the software tools that exist now that have been developed and in use for probably a generation in cost terms, not quite so long for environmental evaluation, are based on data input where you have precise values for what's going to happen throughout the duration of the study period. Having put in these precise values, you get very precise answers. You can have as many decimal places as you like for the whole life cost or whole life environmental impact. But those things that look like precise predictions are actually estimates or guesses. And in the work we've done, we've tried to move from this deterministic approach to a probabilistic approach, where you acknowledge the fact that a lot of data isn't certain. Certainly, as you go further into the future, it gets less certain. Here's a little warning about the dangers of prediction. Obviously, when you're embarking on life cycle evaluation, you're thinking long term. The whole point is to think long term. But how do you make predictions? Here were some architects and designers who were thinking long term. Very commendable thing to do in 1960 for a new college in Cambridge, and they were thinking about what fuel to use. And they thought very carefully about what was happening in 1960 and what they thought would happen in the future, and they got it completely wrong. They designed the building for electric heating, and it's been a disaster ever since. It's a real, bad decision based on the best intentions. So that's a warning of the difficulty and possibly the dangers of making predictions and believing your predictions. David Churchill showed this slide of historic data for the variation in fuel prices, the volatility of fuel prices. David said, well, that's historic data, that's a fact, but what happens when you want to look forward? Well, when you look forward and you project past volatility, each of these scenarios is equally probable. They're all consistent with past volatility. Which one do you choose? Absolutely no way of choosing. In reality, there are some things looking into the future where you can say there's no uncertainty. Probably the date of, the hour of sunrise and sunset is probably about the only thing where you can be definite that you know what's going to happen next year or 10 years or 100 years' time. Usually, there's some uncertainty when you look into the future, and often there's a lot of uncertainty. Given that that's the case, it's very difficult to give deterministic single-point estimates for almost anything happening in the future, which is what you have to do in deterministic LCC. What is easier to do and more realistic is to give a range of values you think are possible. And one of the simplest and quite effective way of giving estimates of a range of possible things is the 3-point estimate. You give a most likely value, the highest imaginable value, the lowest imaginable value. And that's, in a way, You might say, well, that's more complicated, but actually it's simpler. That's more consistent with your experience and knowledge, and not really difficult, probably easier than trying to give single point estimates. I'm going to give a little example of how you might use one of these probabilistic estimates looking into the future. This is to do with the service life uncertainty, which was the point raised by one of the first questioners. The intervals between component replacements and the uncertainty of that interval. We did a study of the component replacement in a block of flats for elderly people, housing association block. In fact, when I used to be a real architect, I designed this block of flats about 30 years ago. We modelled the replacement cycle of 11 components, and then worked out the cumulative cost over 37 years. And the red line is the deterministic estimate of predicting the replacement cycle. You can see it has these little steps, the steps when you have major replacements. And you arrive at a deterministic value of about £850,000 accumulated cost over these years. If you replace the deterministic predictions with a range, you can then do multiple simulations, and sometimes the simulations will be higher than the deterministic, sometimes will be lower. And the rather faint lines that sort of mask, well, not cover, that spread out beside the red deterministic line show a probabilistic range of outcomes. And you can see sometimes it's more than 850,000, sometimes it's less. You can look at that range at the end of 37 years, and it has obviously this distribution. The average is, as you might expect, around £850,000, but half the time it's more, half the time it's less. You can see that 50th percentile, just around 850,000. Well, that's true, but what use is that? What do you gain by having this distribution rather than just having the average number? Well, what you gain is if you wanted to manage risk. Many investors would not be happy with the risk of budgeting where they knew there was a 50% chance that they were going to exceed the budget. They would say, I'm not comfortable with that. They might say, I would much rather have a budget where I had 80% confidence that I would be safe and 20% risk of exceeding. Then, knowing this distribution, you can say how much additional funding should be put into the budget to give you 80% confidence. And here we're saying the budget should be not 850,000 but 911. That's something you can't do with deterministic evaluation, but you can with probabilistic. Second point of my 4 points, looking to the future and moving from deterministic probabilistic to this additional feature, what we've called options-based LCC, LCA. And this is all to do with future decisions. The conventional approach in LCC, LCA is when you're comparing two alternatives, say A and B, might be a floor finish, roofing specification, who knows. You're comparing alternatives, and if they're relatively short life, like a finishes, there are many replacements during the 60-year, typically a 60-year study period. The conventional assumption is you always have like-for-like replacements. You make one decision and you're committed to it throughout the study period. But we know that isn't right. In reality, every time the component fails, you have a new decision. You might take the same decision, you might take a different decision. That's reality, not the left-hand side. The right-hand side is reality. And of course, the choices that you're faced with, the alternatives you're faced with will change during the life of most buildings. New products will come onto the market, old ones will disappear. You don't replace asbestos like for like these days. And the important point we want to make is that these future decisions are good. They improve the building performance. They mean that people are making decisions with new knowledge that's not available at the beginning. With new knowledge, they can take better decisions. So these future decisions, which we've called, the decision might be called then life cycle options, these are beneficial. The more life cycle options you can feed into a project, the better. And they will increase the value of the project. Flexible design. A design with many life cycle options, you can call it a flexible design. People in the future can make new decisions. That's what we mean by flexibility. Flexibility means a design with life cycle options. Here's a little highly simplified example of a flexible design. A building, and you're trying to decide on the amount of insulation to put into the building. Let's suggest there are two alternatives. You could have the quite high level of insulation, based on current standards, which are, quite high nowadays. Or you could say, current standards aren't enough. I want super insulation because standards may go up in the future, maybe. So you've got a choice. Now, if you were doing a cost-based LCC analysis, the assessment of which of these is the best in whole life cost terms will depend on the future price of energy. If energy prices rise, then super insulation will pay off. If energy prices don't rise, then perhaps high insulation would be better value. Let's suppose there are two scenarios for the price rises, what we call a trend, which is sort of the rate of increase that people think now is likely, or a steep increase where it goes way up. For the two alternatives, high insulation, super insulation, you can compare the performance with the two scenarios. And as you can see, if you have high insulation and a steep price rise, the building will turn out to be under-insulated and a building you wouldn't wish to have. But if the trend takes place, that's good, that's an efficient solution. On the other hand, super insulation, if there's a steep price rise, that's great, you've got an efficient building, but if the trend says, carries on, then you've over-insulated, wasted money, and haven't got benefit from that extra insulation. Very difficult to know. I mean, whatever you do, you're running the risk of making a bad decision, and you've got no way of predicting the future energy price. A flexible alternative. If you could design a building with the high level of insulation, which is efficient for current prices, and if in that building you could have this life cycle option to upgrade the insulation if the price rose, then you can be efficient. Whatever happens, you're protected. The option gives you the flexibility to respond to future outcomes. The principle makes sense. Can that be calculated? And this is an example done with colleagues. Hannes and other colleagues worked on this little example for in the CILECCTA project. A simplified example, but it is a calculated example. This is the case study. The data for 1 square metre of wall. I'm not going to go through the figures, but the important point is the asterisk at the bottom. This includes an uncertain variable, which is the future price of oil in this case, and that's put forward as a 3-point estimate, and that estimate is the annual rate of change. In any one year, it could go down a little bit, most likely go up a little bit, it could go up a lot. And every year through the study period, you apply that 3-point estimate to future projections. The other point I want to draw attention to is the cost, just above that blue line for the uncertainty about fuel price. There's a line for the cost of the insulation upgrade. If you have this option to upgrade the insulation, how much will it cost to exercise that option? Well, that also depends on the fuel price, because in this example, the insulation, and as Hannes mentioned, insulation often is petroleum-based. This was expanded polystyrene. So if energy prices go up, you want to insulate, but insulation prices also go up, and the model has to then balance when it's cost-effective to make exercise the upgrade. We ran this model for 10,000 scenarios, 10,000 different, you saw those little wiggly lines of future oil prices, all equally probable. We ran 10,000 of those. For each of those 10,000 runs, we figured out the cost of fuel and the emissions for this building. We scaled up the 1 square metre of wall to the whole size of the building. So you get data for the discounted cash flow for the cost of fuel and the emissions which are not discounted. And you can plot those on this 2D graph, which could be labelled, the name's been put, that's an eco-portfolio, with this 2D graph showing cost and environmental impacts on one graph. And for each of the three alternatives, the current insulation, super insulation, and the flexible strategy, there's a cost and there's an environmental impact. Well, that's nice that they're brought together in one environment instead of having sort of two sets of data which are unrelated. They're now brought together, but you still have two parameters, but you've got to make one decision. How do you make one decision based on these two different sources of data? In reality, different investors will make different decisions with the same data, and that's quite legitimate. It's a bit like Andy Green explained at the beginning about when you buy a house. Everybody's looking at the same houses, but they make different decisions. And that's absolutely right. There's no reason people should all choose the same house. In the same way, there's no reason people should choose the same strategy here. Initially we showed blobs, but sort of points, but of course when the data is uncertain in the Monte Carlo simulation, you'll actually get sort of blobs of uncertain areas. That doesn't change the principle. I'm now going to describe how two different kinds of investors would look at this data on this table. Supposing you were an investor who thought environment was really the critical factor, and you were less concerned about cost, either because you had lots of money or for whatever other reason, but environment was your critical factor in decision making. These contours might indicate your sort of level of the goodness of solution. And as you move towards the origin of this graph, you're going up the contour lines. So you want to choose the solution that's on the highest contour. And in this case, it's solution B, as you can see. Solution B is on the highest contour for this decision maker. You can see above that it has the lowest environmental impact. And for that decision maker, that's the best solution. Another decision maker might weight things differently. He might be more concerned about cost, either because he hasn't got any money or for other reasons, it's actually more important to cost. And then the contours, you also have contours, but the contours are organised slightly differently, reflecting the weighting between cost and environment. In this case, the contours again, you're trying to go as high as you can, moving towards the origin. But in this case, because the contours are aligned differently, it's this option C, the flexible option, flexible alternative, that is on the highest contour. So that decision maker will choose that alternative, and you can see this above, that's the one with the lowest expected cost. So these ideas of uncertainty, I should move on. Final slide. These ideas are being brought together in CILECCTA's software, which is under development, not yet available to the public, but it's under demonstration downstairs, and after the end of the research project, the idea is to bring it to the market. That software will make it possible to move into this new territory for the LCC LCA. You'll be able to use data entry using value ranges, not just single point estimates. That's very straightforward and easy, as you may have seen on the demonstration. You'll be able to simulate many future scenarios, Monte Carlo simulation, giving probabilistic results. You can then analyse these probabilistic results, not just the average values. The average values may not change, but you get additional information about the probability distributions. You'll be able to describe flexible design strategies which incorporate life cycle options. Those are defined, and you'll see in the software through the what the options are and how they're exercised. It's all described in the software. And the software will enable you to run calculations and get numbers, numerical answers for these kind of problems. Of course, the software will also allow you to run single point estimates and run deterministic models. If you just don't use these facilities, you don't have to use them. You can use it just like a conventional deterministic tool, but the intention is to make the additional features very readily accessible, very easy to use, and hopefully they will be used. And actually, a fifth point, I didn't really mention it. It has this facility where it's both doing the LCC and the LCA in one environment. You can get consistency of data inputs and consistency of presentation so you can look at them together. They're still two separate values, but you can see them together, and therefore we hope it'll be easier to make decisions based on the two factors. That's what I have to tell you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you ever so much, William. That was a great presentation. I'd like to say that I heard all sorts of things from it. I heard that we're moving from a deterministic model of life cycle assessment and life cycle costing, which gives you a specific answer, to a more probabilistic approach, which gives you effectively a range of values. It also says that we're moving from effectively an approach where we identify the impact of different options at the outset of the project to ones where we can actually maximise the value of the project by considering changes during the lifetime of the project. So that was great from my perspective. It did seem to me that this whole approach is moving forward increasingly complicated in one sense. It's more sophisticated, so more flexible, but you're talking about options within options within options within probabilities, as opposed to perhaps the current approach, which limits its flexibility, but at least is perhaps more comprehensible. Is that a fair...
You have a point, that is a fair point, but on the other hand, one of the motivations when myself and colleagues Cambridge Architectural Research started working on this idea of options-based, the options-based approach and flexibility and so on, was stimulated by interacting with building managers, surveyors, on real projects. We did a Partners in Innovation project, which had industry collaboration, quite a good scheme to fund. And some of these managers, old-timers who'd been in the industry for many, many years, said, oh, yeah, we know about life cycle costing, but we don't trust it. You know, they'd been around and they'd seen all these predictions going wrong, and they said, no, we use our judgment. We don't use those tools, we use our judgment. And they're right, their judgment was better than the tools because the tools were so crude. And when we used our more sophisticated tool to model their decisions were right, and the crude tools were wrong. So there is an additional step forward in the approach, but it is actually, for a good reason, that the current tools are crude and give unreliable results. And actually, our impression, and you may be able to tell me more about this, is that LCC, although it's a well-known technique, at that time we were thinking of LCC, not LCA. LCA is a well-known technique. It is not very widely used, and one reason why we felt it was not very widely used is because it doesn't give any, the results are useless. I mean, who would use a tool that gives useless results? Even if it's simple, if it's useless, even if however simple it is, you wouldn't use it. Our hope was that by having a better tool, which gave good results, it would actually increase the take-up and make people more willing to use LCC, even though it was more challenging.
I'm taking this, it's an iterative process. It's not one answer to a particular problem or challenge. It's something that needs to be reappraised and refocused as time changes, the climate changes, the operation of the building changes, and it's a management tool, really, isn't it?
You're right. The world is constantly moving forward, and the essence that we would say is that these tools are for making today's decisions. They're not tools for making tomorrow's decisions. They'll be made tomorrow. Look at today's decisions. You don't have to plot a sequence of decisions for many years into the future. People in the future will make those decisions. Just look at today's decision, and the more flexibility you can give, the better, because then these people in the future will make, we don't have to make them, they'll make them and make them better. So in the sense it's iterative, each year or each cycle, people will do a new analysis with new data and new knowledge. That's fine, but you, I'm saying you don't have to anticipate that. You just look at today's decision. What's the right thing today? Build in the options. Let the future look after itself.
It's for today's decision making.
Yes, and it's iterative in the sense that in the future people will use the tool again to make new decisions. So it's iterative that every stage in the building there are new decisions to be made, but we don't make them. People in the future will make them.
And Kim Busria again. Do you think there's a danger that this is, because they're quite complex behind the scenes, the black box approach will reign supreme and people will not understand either what they're putting in or what they're getting out?
I can see that there is a danger of that, but I guess the answer to that is to keep it simple and make it as clear as you can, because that's equally true of current LTC. You put numbers in, you get a number out. I mean, one of the big problems, which has been mentioned, David mentioned it, in current LTC, is the discount rate. It makes, transform the answer, change the discount rate, you get a different answer. What's the right discount rate? Nobody knows. And you say, oh, we'll use 3.5%, that's the government rate. Is it the right rate? Almost certainly not, because it'll vary project to project. And so already we're living in a black box world, and you get answers and you don't know where they came from. That's not good, but it's true.
Yes, I had a very similar question to Anne, which is that there's a trade-off between essentially going for more sophisticated software that can effectively hide all the data behind it so the user doesn't have to make too many choices, and ultimately being able to make sense of the outputs. And the question I've got is not so much entirely supportive of your approach, because I can see it makes sense, but to what level do we have to improve the sophistication of the, if you like, the user or the client to actually make the use of these tools and where we are now?
Well, I mean, if we're professionals in trading and presenting to non-professional clients and presenting alternatives open to them and trying to guide them into making the best decision to suit their priorities. I don't know if that's so different from other aspects of professional advice, but one thing that is important to do when you're running these studies and entering data values is it can be very useful to enter a range of values and say, enter alternative discount rates, enter alternative information about cost, all right, and then you can see a kind of landscape of possibilities rather than just one answer. And in that landscape, you may get a better feel of where it's safe territory and where you feel comfortable. If you're just giving one and say yes or no, how do you know? But if you're shown there's a range, would you rather be over here or rather over there? Then that may be easier for people to decide.
Any further questions? All right, in that case, thank you very much, Robert. Okay,